Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ADA Healthcare and the ADA Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities webinar series. My name is Pam Williamson, and I am the Assistant Director of the Southeast ADA Center. I'm joined today by Oshie Harrison, Director of the New England ADA Center, and we will be your moderators for today's webinar. This series of webinars is brought to you by the Pacific ADA Center on behalf of the ADA National Network. The ADA National Network is made up of 10 centers that are regional centers that are federally funded to provide training, technical assistance, and other information as needed on the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can reach your regional ADA center by calling 1-800-949-4232. Next slide, please. Real-time captioning is provided for this webinar. The caption screen can be accessed by choosing the CC closed caption icon in the meeting control bar. To toggle the meeting control bar permanently on, press the Alt key once and then press the Alt key a second time. As always, in our sessions, only the speakers will have audio. Next slide, please. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or prefer to listen by phone, you may dial 1-669-900-2128 or 1-646-558-8656. The webinar ID is 837-2204-3591. Please note this is not a toll-free number. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and can be accessed on www.adapresentations.org website at http://adapresentations.org/archive.php, and it will be available next week. Next slide, please. You may type and submit questions in the chat area box or press Alt-H and enter text in the chat area. If you are listening by phone and not logged into the webinar, you may ask questions by emailing them to adatech@adapacific.org. This webinar series is intended to share issues and promising practices in healthcare accessibility for people with disabilities. The series topics covers physical accessibility, effective communication, and reasonable modification of policy issues under the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, also known as the ADA. Upcoming sessions are available at www.adapresentations.org under the Schedule tab, then follow to Healthcare. These webinars occur every month on the fourth Thursday of the month at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 1:30 p.m. Central Time, 12:30 p.m. Mountain Time, and 11:30 a.m. Pacific Time. By being here, you are on the list to receive notices for future webinars in this series. The notices go out 2 weeks before the next webinar and open that webinar to registration. You may follow along on the webinar platform with the slides. If you are not using the webinar platform, you may download a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation at the Healthcare Schedule webpage at www.adapresentations.org. At the conclusion of today's presentation, there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions, and you may submit your questions using the chat area within the webinar platform. The speakers and I will address them at the end of the session, so feel free to submit them as they come to your mind during the presentation. Next slide, please. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please send a private chat message to the host by typing in the chat window. Type your comment in the text box and enter. You may also use the keyboard Alt-H to access the chat box via keyboard keys, or you may email adatech@adapacific.org or call 831-6714, and that's voice or relay. Oshi, at this time, I would like to turn it over to you to introduce our topic for today and also our speaker.
Thank you, Pam. Today's ADA National Network Learning Session is titled Healthcare and Civil Rights in the Opioid Crisis, DOJ on Utilizing the ADA and Other Civil Rights Laws. The opioid crisis has been an ongoing major issue in the United States. The treatment of those with opioid use disorder in both health systems and the criminal justice system has also raised civil rights concerns. Today's discussion will focus on the Department of Justice and how it has been using the Americans with Disabilities Act and other federal civil rights statutes to address the opioid crisis. Today's speaker is Gregory Dorchek. Greg is an assistant U.S. attorney in the Civil Rights Unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts, where he has worked since 2015. Greg's office has entered into numerous settlement agreements and letters of resolution to ensure ADA compliance arising from opioid use disorder mistreatment in healthcare and in the justice system. These agreements sparked many others across the country. Last year, Greg co-authored a journal article with David Sinkman of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Louisiana. The title of this article is Using the Americans with Disabilities Act to Reduce Overdose Deaths. The article provides evidence that when people have access to their doctor-prescribed medications to treat their addiction, overdose deaths go down. I'll put the link to this article in the chat. Greg also teaches disability rights at Boston University's School of Law. He received his JD from Northeastern University and his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. As a professional, a colleague, and a collaborator, Greg is a person that many of us can count on. He is readily available to staff at the New England ADA Center, to people with addiction and recovery and their families, and to addiction professionals. It is my good fortune to introduce you to Gregory Dorchek and your good timing to meet him. Greg?
Thank you, Ochi, and thank you so much for the kind words. And thank you, everybody, today for joining me here. I actually didn't plan on wearing the same outfit that I have in the photo here, so that's a lovely coincidence. You can tell it's me, although more beard, I believe, and more gray, sadly. But if you could go to the next slide, what I want to do today is talk about the ADA, how we use it to address the opioid crisis in the Department of Justice, and how our work can be replicated elsewhere, it can be replicated by advocates in the community. And it's important for folks to know, just to understand that there is a strong role for disability rights in the opioid crisis. Next slide, please. Today, I want to talk about three different things, three different learning objectives. First, I'm going to kind of give the overview of the opioid crisis and its relationship to both the criminal justice systems and health systems, where I'm going to talk about how routinely people with opioid use disorder are denied access to medication, and that ends up perpetuating the opioid crisis. A lot of times people focus when talking about the opioid crisis on supply. If you're thinking about this, economically, the supply of drugs. But if you also think about opioid use disorder as a disability, a treatable disability, you recognize that there's also the demand component. And too often, understanding that people have opioid use disorder and that addiction lasts, whether or not there is the supply of drugs or not, that the reducing the supply of drugs doesn't necessarily treat the disability. So I want to talk about that relationship and give an overview of the use disorder and how it is tied into the criminal justice system and the health system. Then I'm going to talk about how the ADA and also other federal civil rights statutes, here I'm thinking of the Fair Housing Act and Section 504, protect individuals with OUD or opioid use disorder in ensuring access to their medication that treats the addiction. And then finally, I'm going to close out today by talking about the Department of Justice and specifically how we've tied that together, how we've used the ADA, the Fair Housing Act, and Section 504 to address ensuring access to healthcare for people with opioid use disorder. As always, I'm happy to take questions as we go along and as well as at the end. I'm going to provide copies of guidance that the Department of Justice has released on the relationship between the ADA and opioid use disorder, just so you have that ready. I just have to remember when we get to the end, I have the link ready to go, and I'll drop that in the chat so that everybody has it available. But to give it a start, could you go to the next slide, please? So let's give an overview of the problem. And the problem is the criminal justice system and health systems routinely deny persons with opioid use disorder access to their medications, and that perpetuates the opioid crisis. So diving in, next slide, please. I want to give an overview of the opioid crisis. We hear a lot about it in the news and media. It's always on the front page, it seems, at least here in Massachusetts, which has been hit particularly hard by the opioid crisis. But according to the CDC, 109,680 individuals died from opioid overdoses in the United States in 2022. And this was the highest number ever recorded. In Massachusetts, the numbers were just released for 2022, showing that 2,300 individuals died of opioid overdoses in 2022. That was the highest number on record for Massachusetts. Now, when we're talking about those numbers, there's a different kind of stratification of who is hit, the vulnerable populations that are necessarily impacted by the opioid crisis. And at the key to this is the criminal justice system and injustice-involved individuals, and specifically newly returned prisoners who are 120 times more likely to die of an opioid overdose than the rest of the population. Now, I'm happy to provide links to all of the statistics that I give throughout. Please reach out to me. My email address will be found at the end. The article that Ochi mentioned that I wrote last year with David Sinkman also cites these numbers. But the rough factor is the criminal justice involved individuals are by far leaps and bounds the most impacted by the opioid crisis. And if you go to the next slide. First, I want to talk about what opioid use disorder is. Now, I'm going to use the acronym OUD for opioid use disorder throughout. You might hear me use an acronym sometimes called SUD, which is substance use disorder. OUD is a subset of SUD. So substance use disorder is the name of the DSM-5 gives to a whole broad range of use disorders, whether or not it's alcohol use disorder, opioid use disorder, cocaine use disorder. We, by common vernacular, we refer to these as addiction or forms of addiction. But OUD is going to be kind of the focus that I have here today. But some of the information about protections will fall and address other use disorders as well. But if we think of opioid use disorder as a, I apologize for the beeping, should stop now. The DSM-5 gives a number of characteristics for what opioid use disorder is, but you can think of it as a chronic brain disease, so chronic disease. It's going to be something that somebody has chronically treated for the rest of their life. It's a chronic brain disease where a person has cravings for opioids, is compelled to chronically use opioids despite negative consequences. Now, those negative consequences might be impacts on interpersonal relationships, might be impacts on the ability to obtain housing, to maintain a job, and so on. The need for increased use of opioids to achieve a high or a euphoria, and the body physically going through withdrawal when not using opioids. Now, it's important to know there's a large fear factor when we talk about opioids and the crisis in the media. But it's important to know that not everybody who uses opioids develops opioid use disorder. In fact, only about 24%, a rather small number of people who use opioids develop opioid use disorder. So somebody might need opioids for pain management. That person, if they're using it as prescribed and consistent with the doctor's orders and does not exhibit these other symptoms, would be not indicating or not having an opioid use disorder. Similarly, somebody who might have a surgery or might have an experience at a dentist office, often after dental surgeries, will provide opioids. Just because a person uses the opioids doesn't mean that they are automatically going to, or even likely to develop an opioid use disorder. It demonstrates that some people's bodies develop the use disorder over time. It might be a number of psychosocial aspects that make them predetermined to develop the use disorder. It might be things, part of their body physiology that make them more likely to develop an opioid use disorder. But the important thing is that some people can and do use opioids without developing this, and some people do not. If you can go to the next slide. Now, I want to talk about something. So it's important to know where I'm going here, that I give you a little bit of the scientific background about how opioids work in the body and how opioid use disorder itself works, as well as about how the medications are used to treat opioid use disorder. And to start all of that off, I want to start by talking about what's called the mu receptor. The mu receptor is a part of the body's brain. So it's a part of the brain that controls the body's pleasure system. So this is a part of the brain that's triggered by opioids, but it's also triggered by other bodily processes. So if you've ever heard of the body developing its own natural endorphins, whether or not it's after eating food, whether or not it's after exercise, etc., various activities that we engage with on the day-to-day trigger the mu receptor. But so too do opioids. Opioids trigger the mu receptor, and that's the state of feeling that some people will experience when triggered in a particular way, will experience a euphoria or a high. But it's important to think of the mu receptor. And if you're going to make an analogy, I want you to think of the mu receptor as a cup. Okay, it's a vessel. And when the mu receptor is being triggered, let's think of ourselves as pouring water into that cup. Okay, so that's the mu receptor. Now, next slide, please. So knowing what the mu receptor is, I want to point out opioid use disorder. We hear all of these statistics about people dying regularly, but opioid use disorder is a highly, highly treatable disease, and there are 3 medications that are used to treat it. So keeping the mu receptor and keeping that cup analogy in mind, if you could go to the next slide. The first medication I want to talk about is one called buprenorphine. I can't say that word often, but I might refer to it as bup, which is what many doctors in the medical field will refer to it as well, if they don't want to find themselves stumbling over buprenorphine over and over again. This comes by the name brand Suboxone. So you might hear of Suboxone. When you think of Suboxone, you're thinking of buprenorphine. Buprenorphine is the medical name, well, much like, ibuprofen could be Motrin, I think. Motrin being the name brand, ibuprofen being the drug name. Buprenorphine is the drug name, Suboxone is the name brand. Now, buprenorphine works by activating the mu receptor. So you think of it as filling that cup. But in filling the cup, it has a ceiling effect. So it can only fill the cup so much before at a certain point, it doesn't fill the cup anymore. So let's think of it as filling the cup about halfway, enough to trigger the mu receptor, but the more that you fill in after that, it just doesn't do anything. It overflows, it spills out, and you can only fill of it halfway. So the way that buprenorphine works is by triggering the same receptor in the brain that opioids would work, but doing it only to a certain point so that it's triggered, but somebody is not experiencing the euphoria. The person who's using a person with opioid use disorder who's using buprenorphine is not getting high. Buprenorphine controls cravings, it controls withdrawals. So it's very effective at controlling some of the main things that come with an opioid use disorder. And you can also go to a pharmacy to fill the prescription for buprenorphine. You can go to CVS, you can go to Walmart. So the other key factor is that ceiling effect that I talked about. It actually prevents other opioids from working. So it does enough to trigger the mu receptor, but it helps to prevent other opioids from also triggering the mu receptor because of the way that it binds to the mu receptor. So if somebody were to use heroin while using buprenorphine, the heroin wouldn't have as much of an effect as it would if the person didn't have buprenorphine in the system. And therefore, the person would be protected from an overdose death. Now, I'm not saying it would be a certainty that it would guarantee that they wouldn't have an overdose, but it would cause a high protection against having an overdose with that in the system. So that's medication one, buprenorphine. A similar medication, if you could go to the next slide, is medication number two, which is methadone. So methadone is going to be only the generic. Now, methadone is a highly regulated medication that's been around for decades. It's been around since the 70s, the 60s, and people receive methadone at a methadone clinic. Now, methadone also fills the mu receptor. Think of it as the cup pouring into the mu receptor. It also activates and triggers the mu receptor, but it does so not with that ceiling effect that you get from buprenorphine. It does so with a highly calibrated dose. So somebody who obtains and uses methadone goes to the clinic. The clinic works on finding the right dose and measuring to find the right dose that does not create the euphoria for the person, does not ideally give them side effects such as drowsiness and so on, but does enough to activate the mu receptor to control withdrawals, to control cravings. And with that, the person is able to obtain, a job, go through their normal everyday business without having those cravings and withdrawals that their experience is. Now, because it's highly regulated, you can't just go to a CVS or a pharmacy to pick it up in the United States. There are some countries where that regulatory scheme isn't in effect. In Australia, Portugal, for example, you can go to a pharmacy, not in the United States. You have to go to the methadone clinic, and you have to go there every day for the dosing. Now, the difference between the two, just so you have this kind of in the background, somebody who has a longer opioid use disorder, much more chronic, acute opioid use disorder is probably going to be treated with the methadone because it has more effect for the long-term person, the person who has used heroin, fentanyl, et cetera, for longer terms. So that's the difference between why somebody might have methadone as opposed to buprenorphine. But buprenorphine does have all of the advantages that you don't need to go to the clinic daily. It's much more part of your daily life that you can just pick it up at the pharmacy. It's much less stigmatized because of that. So those are the first two medications. And if you can click on the next slide. So these two medications that I talked about, buprenorphine and methadone, they come in the same class or category of medication called an opioid agonist. Now they're called an agonist because they activate the mu receptor. And I'm going to contrast that with medication 3. If you could click on the next slide. Medication 3 is called naltrexone or Vivitrol. Vivitrol being the name brand for the shot that you receive every 28 days. But Vivitrol works, naltrexone works by blocking the mu receptor from working. It cuts it off. So if you're thinking of that cup, rather than activating it and finding that right calibrated dose to stimulate and control cravings, what this is doing is it's putting a cap on the top. So you go to pour in and nothing can get into the mu receptor. Nothing can get into that cup. However, it doesn't control the cravings. Now, some people might have a placebo effect where they're feeling that they experience less desire to go use opioids, but the long-term control is that this does not control somebody's cravings. The other aspect about naltrexone is it prevents the body's own opioids or endorphins from working in the same way. So there are some downsides. I want to make a huge asterisk and a caveat that I'm not condoning the use of one medication over another. In fact, on the contrary, what I'm doing is pointing out that these are 3 very different medications, and the right medication, as we know from disability rights, everybody's treatment is different, and it requires an individualized assessment because somebody's body might work different, somebody's social aspects might work different in such a way that everybody needs their own clinical evaluation to decide what medication is right for them. One other aspect is on the naltrexone is you have to get a shot every 28 days in order to maintain that cap over the mu receptor. And everybody's body metabolizes that differently. So maybe 26 days for me, maybe 30 days for somebody else. And what's happening, or one of the things that could happen is somebody who then uses an opioid after that 28 days, because the cravings might still be there. There may be some downsides in the fact that they're using a dosage that they thought their body could tolerate because it's what their body had tolerated. But in fact, with that 28 days of not using opioids, their body has reduced the ability to process that dosage. And it can create some danger in that respect. And there are a number of studies showing that. If you can go to the next slide. So that third category of medication, the naltrexone, is what's called an opioid antagonist. So it's a contrast from the opioid agonist. It's an opioid antagonist, and it's called an opioid antagonist because it antagonizes, it blocks the mu receptor from working. So that's the overview of the 3 different medications, thinking of that cup, thinking of methadone and buprenorphine as activating, filling the cup, and thinking of naltrexone as blocking the cup. If you can go to the next slide. Now, opioid agonists, studies show that opioid agonists reduce overdose death by more than 50%. Some studies show as much as 80%. There are a number of studies out there, but the point is they are highly effective at reducing overdose death. Next slide. Here's the problem. Only 1 in 3 people with opioid use disorder have access to these medications. So we just talked about the entire start about the large volumes of individuals in the country that die of opioid overdose every year. I believe it's 1 in 20 people, at least in Massachusetts. It's about 5% of people in Massachusetts have an opioid use disorder. Large number, and I don't want to say that extrapolates across the country, but a large number of people have opioid use disorder, and yet so few people have access to these life-saving medications. And one of the reasons why, if you could go to the next slide, please, one of the reasons why is stigma. So stigma for opioid use disorder and stigma for the treatments are one of the main inhibitors to people actually receiving the standard of care for opioid use disorder. So first of all, there's a non-medical understanding of addiction that is even prevalent in the recovery community that might focus on somebody needing to go cold turkey or not necessarily in true recovery unless they're off of those medications. So this theory or this feeling, if we're stigmatizing the medication, stigmatizing the treatment as the medication for opioid use disorder. That's an acronym you're going to hear me say, MOUD, medication for opioid use disorder, as replacing one drug for another. So you'll hear somebody say, oh, they've just replaced their heroin with their buprenorphine or with their Suboxone, when it's really confusing the idea of addiction, which is where somebody is engaging in behavior that's compulsive, that's attempting to reach a high, with dependence on a prescribed medication. Somebody might, if we're thinking of other chronic diseases, somebody might be dependent on insulin to treat their diabetes. Just because they use the insulin every day does not make them addicted to insulin. It means that they are dependent on the insulin to treat their diabetes. So that distinction between the medication used to treat the opioid use disorder as something that they are dependent on versus the addiction, which is the result of compulsive behavior, not at the direction of a doctor, not under a clinical setting. And so that confusion creates a lot of stigma for methadone, for buprenorphine mostly. There's not as much stigma for Vivitrol. Vivitrol or naltrexone doesn't necessarily carry that same stigma. Much of the reason is because it's not an opioid agonist. It doesn't trigger or activate the mu receptor. And so therefore people see it as some way different than the opioid agonist, at least in the way that the stigma plays out. You can go to the next slide. And this even comes with doctors who are not addiction specialists, who understand that addiction is disease, but they prefer not to treat people with addiction. This is something that happens in cases where I've brought, because doctors who decide, we don't want to provide, it's not even just they don't want to provide addiction treatment to people with addiction. They don't want to provide their normal treatment, whether or not it's their surgeons, whether or not that they run a long-term care facility and so on. There is an aversion to providing normal healthcare treatment to people with addiction. There was a study that showed that cardiovascular surgeons, for example, might not want to, in the study by Dr. Simeon Kimmel and Dr. Elise Wirsell out of Boston, the study shows that doctors don't want to provide stents to people with a history of addiction, because they're just going to have to provide another stent down the road because the person keeps using again. And this is a life-saving treatment that sometimes requires this kind of acute intervention. And those statements of they're just going to use again, you make the comparison to somebody who has high cholesterol. I have high blood pressure. I am going to have a cheeseburger. And I'm going to, revert to some of the behavior that may have caused my hypertension. Somebody with high cholesterol is going to revert to some behavior that may cause their high cholesterol. And yet those people who revert to that behavior are not being stigmatized or punished for reverting to that behavior. So making those comparisons to other chronic diseases can sometimes reveal where this stigma and these beliefs in statements like this, how they can be discriminatory and have discriminatory effects. Next slide, please. And finally, one of the major places where this stigma exists is in the criminal justice system. So I talked about 1 in 3 people having access to opioid use disorder medication, despite many more requiring this medication, despite the life-saving potential of this medication. And this goes to jails and prisons. In the United States, 80% of jails and prisons provide no form of medication for opioid use disorder. They provide cold turkey. They might say that perhaps we will give somebody a shot of Vivitrol on the way out as we release them into the community, but they're not providing the treatment within the jail or prison as if they would to any other chronic disease that goes through their jail or prison. Similarly, judges, probation officers, and parole officers who have this stigmatized view of buprenorphine, who might see people illicitly using buprenorphine on the street, and they might say that those people are just being sneaky, and they're just getting high, and so therefore I'm going to order them off of their buprenorphine. It is common for people to illicitly use buprenorphine, but the vast majority of those people are, in fact, 85% of people, according to a 2018 study by Cicero, 85% of those individuals use the illicit buprenorphine for clinically appropriate reasons. They're treating their opioid use disorder because they can get a strip of Suboxone on the street and they just don't want to use heroin today. They don't want to experience the cravings and withdrawals. So they're going to begin treatment sometimes illicitly, not under the care of a doctor. Those people actually, when they do find a doctor, do well in treatment. But the point of the matter is some of that has led to this stigmatized view of the medication for opioid use disorder. And as a result, 80% of jails and prisons, no MOUD, no form of medication for opioid use disorder at all. If you could go to the next slide. So you saw there how there is this very key tool that we have to intervene in this very acute health crisis. Opioid use disorder, very acute chronic disease, highly treatable. 50 to 80% of people with opioid use disorder could be prevented from an overdose death if they were treated with one of the forms of medication. And yet only 1 in 3 people don't have access or have access to the medication. So now I want to talk about how federal civil rights statutes protect individuals with opioid use disorder and ensures access to medications used to treat their addiction. Next slide, please. So I'm going to presume that many people, given the nature of the ongoing series, most people here are familiar with the ADA. So I don't want to give the broad impact of what the Americans with Disabilities Act is. I think we can all be assured that just as a reminder, a disability protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act is a physical or mental impairment that affects one or more major life functions. And when the ADA was drafted in 1991, it was very clear that it addressed addiction. So in fact, here is a copy of the regulations, and I grayed out all of the non-important words just to point out that physical or mental impairment includes drug addiction and alcoholism. So it's very clear when the drafters drafted the ADA, Fair Housing Act similarly, Section 504 similarly, when it was drafted, addiction was covered. If you can go to the next slide. And I think if you can click through here, actually, we'll keep it there. Treatment is inherently linked to disability. So when barriers are created to treatment, those barriers are tied to a disability. So for example, and here's where we get to this point where, as I'll discuss, there are a number of facilities that might say, we will take people with opioid use disorder into our facility, but we will not take people on medication for opioid use disorder in our facility. There were a number of long-term care facilities in Massachusetts, and there still are, that just would not accept patients if they were prescribed buprenorphine or if they were on methadone treatment. They just refused to allow those people. They might accept other patients who had opioid use disorder, but they're just saying, we don't want people on those medication in our facility. And that would be akin to saying, we accept people with mobility impairments here, but we will not accept somebody with a walker in our facility who needs a walker to enable their mobility with their mobility impairment. Treatment is inherently linked to disability. So when barriers are created to treatment, those barriers are tied to disability. Next slide, please. Talking about Title II, or state and local governments that have to provide indiscriminate services, medical care that's provided to justice-involved individuals is a service that disabled inmates must receive indiscriminately under the ADA. So therefore, a jail or prison, I just talked about how 80% of jails or prisons refuse to provide medications for opioid use disorder in their jail or prison. That means 80% of jails and prisons are violating the ADA because they're not providing their services indiscriminately. They are making administrative decisions. These are not medical decisions to not provide this medication. It's not an individualized assessment by a doctor. It's just categorically a superintendent saying, we're not going to provide those medications here. Similarly, medical decisions that rest on stereotypes about the disabled rather than an individualized inquiry into a patient's condition, they may also be considered discriminatory under the ADA. And this impacts the people with opioid use disorder, as I'll give some examples coming up. And finally, withholding a medication used to treat addiction without an individualized inquiry into the patient's condition may be considered discriminatory. So again, what we're getting down to is things that impair or prohibit or cut off access to somebody's medication used to treat that opioid use disorder. If it's not based on a medical decision that's not built upon stereotypes, that could be discriminatory under the ADA. Could be discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act if we're talking about access to somebody's housing in, let's say, a halfway house or a recovery home. That these would all be violations of the ADA, the Fair Housing Act, or Section 504. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give examples of what that means when we're looking at the ADA and the Fair Housing Act, and how at least the department has begun applying this and what we've done so far. If you can go to the next slide. So since 2018, DOJ has entered into more than 25 settlements to resolve discrimination involving opioid use disorder. Now, if you think about that, I mentioned that addiction was covered since the inception of the ADA in 1991. There have been a smattering of cases that have involved maybe land use and the building of recovery homes or treatment centers, and whether or not cities and towns would put up zoning roadblocks. Some people are familiar with those kinds of cases that DOJ has brought. But largely until 2018, this notion of medication for opioid use disorder as being, access to it as being protected under the ADA had gone unrecognized. It was something that the department frankly was unaware of and did not recognize that this was happening. And it did not recognize the role that it had played in the opioid crisis altogether. Since then, DOJ has really reversed course and gone to address this and really has been aggressive, especially in the last few years, has been aggressive in resolving cases in this area. So if you can go to the next slide. So in addition to the guidance that the DOJ has released, which I see is in the chat at 2:49 p.m., you can see in the chat there, there's a link to the guidance. The guidance is lovely. It's been vetted and we've gone over it quite a bit. It gives examples, it gives Q&A, it gives guidance. So I highly recommend people going through that, perusing it and sharing it. But I want to talk about three main areas that DOJ has entered into agreements, but also has brought lawsuits. And the first is in trial courts and probation. So the United States has entered into an agreement with the Massachusetts trial court system that was entered into, I believe, just last year. And this was as a result of some judges and some probation officers ordering people off of their buprenorphine as a condition of being in drug court. As there were drug courts that say we only allow Vivitrol in our drug court. And this is something that's, while the settlement was entered into in Massachusetts, this is an issue that's been going on nationwide, where drug courts, judges essentially making the order from the bench. And if you think about it, it's essentially practicing medicine from the bench. The judge is practicing medicine without a clinical opinion present. And we found this to be a violation under the ADA. Similarly, colleagues of mine in the Justice Department filed a lawsuit against the state of Pennsylvania for Pennsylvania's practice of many of its courts were on a court-by-court basis ordering people off of their buprenorphine as just a matter of policy. And this is where it's being done as a matter of policy. It is an administrative issue. Now, if you know anything about the Justice Department, the fact that the DOJ has filed a lawsuit there is not insignificant. It's much more difficult to file a criminal case and send somebody to jail than it is to file a civil rights lawsuit in the Department of Justice. The number of approvals that need to be gone into have to go all the way up to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights to give every approval. And that's just what happened here. And so that litigation is ongoing. But there's also the settlement agreements that my office has entered into in Massachusetts. And this is an issue that's going on throughout the country. Next is corrections. This is the issue that I mentioned earlier, where 80% of jails and prisons in the United States are not providing this medication. And this is an area that the DOJ is bringing and going after and addressing very, very aggressively right now. As of right now, all Massachusetts prisons and jails are providing the medication, but that wasn't the case in 2018 when we began doing this work. So there's been a large shift. I believe all of New England is now providing all medications for opioid use disorder. New York, Alaska, it's happening state by state, and it's happening very quickly. There are other assistant U.S. attorneys who are working on cases on this, and this is one area that we're working to address very aggressively, because we see the level of intervention that this can have. If many justice-involved individuals are having a substance use disorder, and it's estimated that as many between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5, or 1 in 4. It's estimated between 25 and 50% of all justice-involved individuals have an opioid use disorder. And so if somebody's going through the correctional system and is touching into the correctional system, and yet that correctional system is not providing treatment, it's not providing diagnostic treatment, so it's not inducing people onto medication, it's not maintaining people that are already on the medication as they're going through. This is a high area of intervention that can impact the crisis, which is what the article that I wrote about really addresses. This is one of the major ways that we can intervene in the opioid crisis to have a big impact with a relatively low lift, if you think of the grand scheme of things. And then parole boards. In Massachusetts, what was happening was the parole board was ordering and mandating that people go on to Vivitrol as a condition of parole. And then they changed their ways, but they mandated that people go on to a specific form of treatment. So it was mandating that people on methadone stay on methadone, mandating that people on buprenorphine stay on buprenorphine. That may sound like an improvement, and in many ways it was an improvement, but still a violation of the ADA. And the reason is because that was interfering with the community doctors' decision-making. So let's say that you were on buprenorphine and it's not working for you, and the doctor says, we need to switch you to methadone. If that would happen, the parole officer would come and bring the person back to jail because they're violating the parole by not being on the mandated medication. So what we require that the parole office do here in Massachusetts, the parole board had to, they can mandate that somebody seek care of a doctor and follow instructions of a doctor, but do everything clinically appropriate, not bake into the conditions of parole precisely what that treatment would be. So those are the things that have been done in the criminal justice setting, and that my colleagues in the Department of Justice are aggressively doing right now. But also there's the healthcare setting, the healthcare system that's not in the criminal justice system. And if you can go to the next slide, please. There are two main areas where this is occurring or has been occurring. The first is long-term care facilities. So somebody might ask, why is somebody with opioid use disorder needing care in a nursing home? And it's a very concrete reason. So somebody who has opioid use disorder may have used injectable drugs. So they might have used heroin with a needle. They might have used fentanyl with a needle. And with that, they might have developed bacterial secondary infections. So endocarditis comes to mind as a major one. Hepatitis C is another one. HIV is another one. And some of those secondary infections require 6-week courses of antibiotic treatment that you can't, sure, you could get it in the hospital, but you don't need that hospital level of care. You need something like a nursing home. And so it's very common for people with opioid use disorder to require care in long-term care settings. However, the vast majority of long-term care facilities are just routinely denying care to people with opioid use disorder or with a history of substance use disorder. They say, we're not going to accept these patients. We don't want to deal with this population. And so they're turning them away, essentially denying care because of their disability, because of their addiction. This violates the ADA. There was one report that Stat News did. If nobody's familiar with Stat News, it is a journalism publication that really focuses on the healthcare industry. And in looking at this phenomenon, it interviewed folks in Ohio, for example. And the takeaway from that was that 0% of long-term care facilities in Ohio would accept a patient with a history of addiction. I'm not saying that that's what's happening in Ohio right now, but this was, I believe, a 2018 news article. In Massachusetts at the time, again, vast majority of long-term care facilities were just routinely not accepting patients with opioid use disorder. We entered into our first settlement agreement with a facility called Charwell House, and this is all available on ada.gov in the enforcement section. And I'm going to try to pull up a link to the enforcement section as we're going through. And it looks like that is, and in the enforcement section, which you can find here, I'm sending you to the archived version of ada.gov because it looks like the new version of ada.gov doesn't have all of the links for the old cases. But if you go through there and if you control F for opioids, you will find a number. At this point, I think we've entered into 11 agreements with skilled nursing facilities and long-term care facilities. One of the reasons is we entered into our first agreement with a facility called Charwell House. And what the addiction community found and the healthcare industry found was that it actually had no effect on whether the practices of other facilities were still routinely discriminating. In us in the federal prosecutor mode, we often think of deterrence as one of the reasons to bring cases. We want to deter other people from engaging in similar conduct. But there was no deterrent effect. In fact, there was a study, an eye-opening study, again by Dr. Simeon Kimmel from the Boston Medical Center, that showed that before that settlement agreement and after that settlement agreement, folks from Boston Medical Center were being denied access to long-term care facilities at the same rates. So we opened a large number of additional cases after that to really put it on the map to facilities that this is something that they have to change their practices, and the message was received. Since then, I am now regularly giving talks to the Massachusetts Senior Care Alliance, which is the trade organization for long-term care facilities, to provide guidance on how to comply with the ADA in this area. Next Tuesday, I'm giving a talk for the Department of Public Health here in Massachusetts that's providing training to long-term care facilities. So it takes work, but these practices do change. And so now long-term care facilities are much more likely to provide care to people with opioid use disorder. And what they found is, there was this fear that the sky would fall upon providing care to these facilities, to individuals with this use disorder in their facilities, and the sky very much did not fall. People in long-term care facilities, people in long-term care facilities routinely have a number of complex medical issues, psychological issues that they might be dealing with. And the population with addiction did not provide any necessarily new challenges, just different challenges to providing care, and they were able to provide this kind of treatment. Similarly, surgeons were not providing and still are not providing care and treatment to people with use disorder. We resolved a complaint with Mass General Hospital that again is in the settlement agreements in the ada.gov link that you'll find there. There was somebody who required an organ transplant, a lung organ transplant, and actually there is a news article about this particular case, again in Stat News. But this person required a lung transplant, and the transplant surgeons at Mass General Hospital said, we can't provide the surgery to somebody who's taking buprenorphine for their use disorder. And it was based not necessarily on any scientific diagnostic reason. In fact, the folks from Mass General Hospital's own addiction treatment care were willing to provide kind of the consultation. And this is an important case because what happened here, it wasn't just a straight denial. And thinking of this from the ADA perspective and the legal theory, how the law works, it's important to note this case. Mass General Hospital, the lung transplant specialists routinely consulted with specialists in other organizations, other areas of medicine. And if you think of that, somebody who requires a lung transplant probably has other chronic conditions that are going to cause complexities. And so when those complexities come up, they might consult with a pulmonologist, they might consult with a cardiologist. They are going to consult with those specialists for the other condition. Here, the other condition was addiction, and they did not consult with the specialists in addiction to look into whether or not their concerns for providing the surgery were in fact something that could be resolved. And it was that deviation from their standard course of practice, where their standard course of practice is consult when we don't know what to do. They didn't consult here. That was the violation. In that particular case, the person ended up receiving the lung transplant, but they had to go out of state to do so. And in fact, if you're not familiar with organ transplants, when that happens, quite often you will need a support person that is living with you. And you will need to be living near the facility that's going to provide the transplant so that when the organ comes in, you can have the transplant, you can be ready for the transplant at a moment's notice. And often you might not be able to travel after that transplant. So in this case, the person's mother had to sell her home in order and move states away in order for the person to receive their organ transplant. And so we were able to get compensatory damages to the tune of $250,000 for that denial. Again, all of that is on the enforcement section of ada.gov. But that's an example of a lung or an organ transplant. We've similarly handled cases involving orthopedic surgeons who would not perform full joint replacements to people on MOUD just because they presented some, they might see them as needy according to, this in this particular case. But you can see that stigma really playing a role. If you can go to the next slide. So that is what the DOJ has been doing. We've been aggressively enforcing cases. As I said, there's been 25 settlements since 2018, which is a large portion of DOJ's settlements since 2018. So we've aggressively been working there. I am happy to field questions, but I also am putting my email address on the screen. It's gregory.dorchek@usdoj.gov. And I am happy to field questions, even though I'm based in Massachusetts. I'm happy to field questions from anywhere. And I'm also happy to connect folks with my counterparts anywhere to really talk through these issues as you encounter them, as you see them.
Greg, we thank you so much for providing this excellent overview of the opioid crisis and how the ADA is being used to combat it. I even learned a lot of new stuff today, even though I follow this on a regular basis. So at this point in time, Greg is ready for questions, and you can submit your questions via the chat window. And so then we will read those out for the captioner and for the rest of the audience. Greg, we are waiting as we're waiting for questions. So what if folks were interested in you said you would connect them with their your counterparts if they were interested in pursuing information about this or putting trainings out in their own areas, what would you encourage them to do?
I would reach out to me. I can submit and I can put them in touch with my counterpart who can give trainings, as well as me who can give trainings. We can figure out who's the best person, whether or not it's from the Disability Rights Section in DOJ, another assistant U.S. attorney. As a way of background, I've been giving, so I mentioned that there were 25 settlement agreements. I believe I had 17 of those 25 settlement agreements. It's an area, it's an area that I have really focused on here in Massachusetts, and because of that development of expertise, I have been giving brown bags to my counterparts for the past year, and we generally give 50 to 60 assistant U.S. attorneys, as well as trial attorneys in the Disability Rights Section, talking about issues every month. And so there is a large, even though I have been bringing most of those settled cases, there's now a large bench to draw from of people that have become much more familiar with it and are more than happy to give presentations. I know counterparts in Kentucky have brought a number of cases of late and developed a significant amount of expertise. Same in Seattle. This is really an expertise that's being drawn all across the country, New Jersey, and so on. So don't hesitate. There are plenty of people who would be more than not just willing, but excited to discuss.
Great. So we appreciate that. Well, we have had several questions come in now, and the first one is, are the jails or prisons using medical doctors in those facilities to overcome the decisions of the community treatment providers by saying that they have differing medical opinions?
It's a great question. And what we're seeing in practice is no, that's not what's occurring. What's really happening is we're seeing that this is a policy decision, and that these are policy administratively implemented decisions. There are some cases where some facilities are saying that, medically speaking, we will provide buprenorphine or methadone to pregnant women because a fetus could actually be put in jeopardy if somebody who is pregnant is taken off of their MOUD, but then the jail or prison would take away access to the medication upon the person giving birth and delivery. So no, we haven't seen those issues, at least in terms of the facilities where it's just been administrative denial. What has happened is in some facilities that have then, as a result of settlement or court order, begun providing the medication, there might be some secondary issues that have come along where doctors, might still be resorting to some of those stereotypes about how to treat somebody with addiction. And I'll give you a perfect example is that in the community, somebody needs typically 16 to 24 milligrams of buprenorphine. That's a clinical dose in the community. It might come lower than that. There were some doctors that might say, well, what we want to do is start you fresh. So we're going to bring you down to 2 milligrams. And we're making our medical judgment that 2 milligrams is a good dosage to start you at. And we might increase you from there. That, while they're couching that in medical terms, and that's coming from a medical doctor, that's not based in any medicine. That's not, there's no medical study that demonstrates that that's medically appropriate. And here we rely on some of the medical cases under the law, such as Bragdon v. Abbott, for people who are really familiar with the Supreme Court cases under the ADA that say, when it comes to those medical decisions, what we really want to do is not look at what any individual doctor feels comfortable with, but what the medical community says is a direct threat. If the medical community is saying that's not what you're supposed to be doing, then that's not going to fly in terms of being legally allowed. But those issues have always been ironed out because we really see, as we've been implementing these settlement agreements, there's just that educational need that needs to be done. And nobody's really been steadfast. I think everybody just recognizes there's that educational component. So what you're seeing of those 80% of jails and prisons is it's just a complete administrative ban.
Thank you. So, all right, we've got another question here. It says, what would be some major public policies to push for to reduce harm in communities which are affected by the addiction crisis?
So here in my role, I can't necessarily advocate for policies. I think that's something that the DOJ is really precluded from doing. But I would say, one of the takeaway from my presentation is anything that ensures access to the medication for opioid use disorder is probably going to be beneficial. And also from a policy perspective, you can see that many of these large-scale public entities their policies are not in compliance with the ADA. So if you can align those policy decisions with ensuring that they are compliant with the ADA. So a perfect example is, should the jails and prisons of X jurisdiction provide the medication as a matter of policy? Well, the law, the ADA says that ensuring access to those medications is required. So ensuring that public policies align with the requirements of the law is probably a good place to start. And just given the volume of entities that we see that are just not in compliance as a matter of public policy.
Thank you. We have another question saying, is the law different for those who are still actively using instead of those that are in active recovery? And can medical practitioners refuse to treat? And
this is a great question, and I'm glad you asked both sets of those questions, or asked it in two different ways, because the answer is actually going to be different for those two. So the first question, is the law different for those who are still actively using instead of those in active recovery? And the answer to that question is yes. There is a current illegal use exception for the ADA. And that means that somebody who is illegally using substances, so let's say the person is illegally using cocaine, the person is illegally using heroin, is that person covered by the ADA? No. That person is not covered by the ADA. But don't stop listening, because question two, can medical practitioners refuse to treat? So while I just had that big carve out that people who are legally using substances are not protected by the ADA, there is a huge carve out to that carve out. And that says in the ADA, it says that healthcare facilities, healthcare entities cannot deny health services to people just because they are illegally using substances. So it's this exception to this exception. And while people are treated differently under the ADA if they are illegally using, think of that more in an employment setting. Think of that more in the housing setting, but don't think of that in terms of providing healthcare or access to healthcare, because there, the carve out, there's that second carve out that healthcare services can't be denied to somebody just because they're illegally using. Now, does this mean that a doctor is required to provide all healthcare services? It just means that the person needs to be clinically analyzed. If somebody is going through active withdrawals because of their illegal use or because of their illicit use, it very well might be that they need a different level of care than what that doctor can offer. But if somebody is, let's say, using marijuana illegally, I know that marijuana in different states is still illegal. Just because somebody's illegally using marijuana or may have illegally used opioids yesterday, but is not going through active withdrawals and is not likely to be going through withdrawals, doesn't mean that the doctor can deny them healthcare. It just needs to be a clinically made decision over whether or not that denial is clinically appropriate, and not all denials are.
Thank you so much for that excellent answer. All right, as a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please do put them in the chat area and we will be reading them aloud. And we do have another question. It says, who is usually flagging the ADA treatment or access issues? Or is it families, attorneys, inmate advocates? And what is the fastest route to address ADA issues in prisons and jails?
So on the first question, my experience is that social workers have actually been the largest referral point for this issue. Maybe it's because I give my talks to social workers more than anybody, but I have found that they have been some of the most likely to see these issues. Social workers generally work on the ground. They work with the unhoused population. They work with people who are going through the criminal justice system. They work in hospitals. They work in all of these, they work in shelters. They work in all these different settings where people with addiction are going to touch upon. Somebody who is dealing with their addiction often isn't thinking first thing, okay, I need to contact a federal prosecutor to help me out. In fact, usually they don't want to talk to a federal prosecutor until they know generally what it is that we do. So social workers, doctors, addiction specialists, that's been our greatest source of referrals. What is the fastest route to address ADA issues in prisons and jails? You can always file a complaint at ada.gov. I know that there are a number of advocacy groups, local, who are working on these issues as well. The ACLU has filed lawsuits in Massachusetts, Maine, New York, Kansas, New Jersey. They filed lawsuits all over the place. And so that is one way to address this issue, and they've always been successful. Prisoners' legal services are places that could advocate. Local public defenders, if they know about these issues. What I'm finding more and more often is that judges are withholding sentencing until they can ensure that a particular prison or jail is going to provide the access to the medication. And so even though we're not necessarily seeing it on the civil side, that's on the criminal side, one of the fastest ways to ensure something is happening is make it so that it's interfering with the prosecutor and the sentencing of a particular case. And so that has had an effect as well. So there's a multitude of avenues, but you can always file complaints at ada.gov on this issue. And there's a number of local sources, I would imagine, in your area, if it's anywhere as active as the areas that I've been familiar with.
Great. All right, we have one more question here, and this deals with the resources and data that you were sharing during your presentation. Folks would really like to get access to that, so I'd like to suggest that maybe we can get that and put it with the archives so that folks can get to that information easily. Would that work? That
does work, and I'm going to find, if I can pull up my article. My article is, I think there's like 120 footnotes. And those footnotes are going to have all of the things that I've cited today. So if I can just find where that is online, and I might be able to do that as we're going here.
Greg, are you talking about using the ADA to reduce overdose?
Yep.
I did put that in the chat.
Okay, great.
And
With the URL.
Okay, and I'm putting it in again for folks.
Oh,
so
great.
Perfect. So that's going to have the vast majority of statistics from what I cited. I've been doing this quite a bit now, and so developed a large background of information. So if I gave information that's not cited in here, which majority of it is, and you want to know a source for it, please email me and I can provide you to something I might have just said offhand that I can provide you an actual citation for.
Fantastic. And we will include using the ADA to reduce overdose deaths as part of the resources when we have the archive available.
I
All
also put in there the ADA Addiction and Recovery fact sheet series produced by the ADA National Network as well for folks.
Fantastic. All right, well, at this time, we do not have any more questions, so we're going to head up for our wrap up for the day. Greg, I want to thank you again for all of this excellent information you've shared with us today. So very important and something that many of us have interest in. And you know, if you do have additional questions for our speakers and didn't get a chance to ask your question or want to talk to someone one-on-one, please contact your regional ADA center at 1-800-949-4232. So, and you will receive an email with a link to today's session with an online evaluation. Please complete the evaluation for today's program because we do value your input. We want to thank Greg again for sharing his time and knowledge with us. I want to thank Oshi for making the connection and being with me as a co-moderator today. And it's just as a reminder, today's session will be archived and it's recorded, and it'll be available for viewing next week at adapresentations.org/archive.php. Thank you again for attending today's session, and wishing you a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you everyone in the audience for participating today. Thanks, Pam.